Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master. And before we get into today's episode, smash that like button, make sure that you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. That helps us out on our end with the YouTube algorithm, but also we genuinely love hearing from you guys. We have an awesome community here, and that's thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. So, having said all of that, let's get into it. The prologue to today's game session begins at the home of Devlin Lucius. Dev's father is one of many variants of Arthur, and Dev's mother was an air maiden named Sarah. Like all of Arthur's children, Dev was recently turned into an immortal by one of the other Arthur variants, who had become an immortal himself a long time ago. And he thought he was actually the last of the immortals. And by the way, as we stated in a recent episode of the podcast, right now, when we're using the term immortal in this context, what we are referring to specifically is TSR had an old Dungeons and Dragons product called the Wrath of the Immortals boxed set, which was published all the way back in 1992. So, point being, the Immortals have a bunch of wild abilities. So right now, Dev is actually attempting to create life from scratch. But every time he tries, what he makes basically looks like a transporter accident. So he waves his creations off into non-existence and tries again. And while we kind of played this off for laughs at the time, if you really think about that, it's pretty horrific. And how careless these new immortals are being actually does a really nice job of setting up the tone for where all of this is going. Anyway, so the doorbell rings, and Dev goes and answers it, and he sees this cute goth girl standing there. She's actually featured in the channel art this week. And she's actually some sort of vampire. And in a lot of ways, I kind of played her almost like a teenage version of Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, in that her pseudo creepy look was offset by this really bubbly, positive personality. So Dev right away decides that he's into her, right? And he has this massive charisma, so she's into him too. So she pops her bubble gum and tucks a bit of her hair behind her ear, and she starts to flirt with him. And as he's checking her out, he notices that she's got a lanyard for some sort of company that she seems to work for, as well as a clipboard that has the company's logo on it. And she seems to be conducting some sort of survey. So she starts off by asking for his full name, and he tells her. Then she asks on what date did he become an immortal, and who is his sponsor. So now Dev is kind of torn, because on the one hand, she's really cute, and he really does like her. But on the other hand, he's kind of concerned that whoever she works for already knew who he was and that he had become an immortal, right? Nonetheless, he answers those questions. Then she asks what his sponsor asked him to do to earn his immortality. And this is when Dev begins to suspect that he and the other immortals might be in trouble. Because the old Wrath of the Immortals box set lays out rules for all these hoops that you're supposed to jump through in order to actually become an immortal. And his sponsor broke all of those rules, particularly because he thought there were no immortals left, right? So think of it like if you were the last man on Earth, would you still follow the speed limit? In the end, she asks Dev to sign this questionnaire, and he does. But then he also asks if she'd like to go grab a drink sometime. And she says that she's not much of a coffee drinker, so Dev suggests blood, which again is kind of weird if you really think about it, right? But she nods and smiles and says she'd like that. So she gives him her cell phone number. So then we move on to the next player, who was my daughter. And she was playing Water Bear, aka Tari Gardner, who is another child of one of many Arthurs, who also was recently granted immortality. And she is living with her half brother, Bryce. And while Tari's mom was Aqua, who was a member of the old Continuum team, Bryce's mom was actually the Lady in the Lake of Arthurian legend. And with these two characters is a third character who was actually created by Greg Sheets and who is based on a local Cleveland legend, which is that Lake Erie supposedly has its own version of the Loch Ness Monster called Bessie. Anyway, so in our version of things, Bessie is a male anthropomorphic sea monster who is roughly the same size as characters like the Incredible Hulk or Thanos. Anyway, so Bryce was in an adventure a few years back where he and the team that he was on fought a giant robot squid that doubled as the bad guy's headquarters. And at the end of that adventure, Bryce kept that giant robot squid, moved it to Lake Erie, and has it on the bottom of the lake, not too far away from an amusement park called Cedar Point. And to this day, that's actually where he lives. So, as Bryce, Tari, and Bessie are sitting on a couch playing video games, nearby, they have a moon pool. And for anyone who doesn't know what that is, a moon pool is an opening in the floor of like a ship or a structure that lets you access the water outside of that structure, right? So imagine a vertical shaft or a hole that goes straight down through the hull of the ship or through the floor of, in this case, this underwater headquarters, right? And then the bottom of the hole is open to the water that the headquarters is in, right? And because of the air pressure, the water inside of the headquarters always keeps that water at the same level. Like water doesn't come flowing in. Does that make sense? As always, if it doesn't make sense, say something in the comment section and I'll try to clear it up or, Google moon pool. But at any rate, the point is that the aforementioned characters are sitting on the couch playing video games when from out of the moon pool comes this girl who basically looks like the girl from The Ring. She seems to be undead. She's dripping wet. She's got long, dark hair that's hanging down over her face. And just like the last undead girl, this one also has a clipboard and a lanyard, etc., right? So Water Bear now takes the survey and she actually fills out the answers herself, as does Bryce. Interestingly enough, when the survey asks what sphere Water Bear belongs to, she writes down that she doesn't know what that even means, right? And when it asks what she had to do to earn immortality, she just admits that she did nothing at all. She doesn't seem to get what this implies or where this is going, right? Afterwards, the undead girl falls into the moon pool kind of backwards and just sinks into the dark depths of the cold lake. So Water Bear says they need to really put a door on the moon pool so that doesn't happen again. Then we go to the home of my son's character. And he's the one who is shaped like a human, but he's made of countless little square mirrors, which make him look like a human disco ball, basically, right? And up until now, this character didn't have a name. So my son, excuse me, finally decided to name him Chet, Chet. So when a zombie rings Chet's doorbell, he comes to the door and the zombie sees that Chet has lines of powder on his glass coffee table, as well as bags upon bags of this stuff stacked all over his living room. And as it turns out, before this zombie was a zombie, he actually worked on Wall Street in the 1980s. And he literally partied so hard that he died, only to obviously rise from the dead later. But so, like certain zombies that we've seen in comedy movies over the years, this one retained his memories and most of his personality, etc. So when he sees all of these bags of powder, he asks Chet if that's what he thinks it is. And Chet just smiles and says, "So are you gonna party or what?" So we have Chet roll a d20 and add his charisma modifier to the roll. And Chet rolls a natural 20, right? So this zombie is all in. He just tosses his clipboard aside and makes a beeline for that coffee table, right? Then we go to the Hollow Earth where Fang and Talon have finished dealing with the adult sons of the villain they defeated in their last appearance. He was based on an old book called Gladiator, which featured a character named Hugo Danner, who was the inspiration partially for the Golden Age version of Superman. But this guy got his powers from injections of chemicals that were derived from insects, which gave him the proportionate strength and durability of an insect, but it also gave him their more primal impulses, right? So this villain and his army of adult sons were all far more inclined to follow their base desires, and as such, they had committed no end of evil acts, right? So, so now Fang and Talon are burying all of these guys, right? Because they don't want it to like attract more problems, basically. And again, I thought this was really interesting because the immortals who are supposed to be opposed to entropy and death and all that stuff are inadvertently doing things that the opposing team is into, right? Anyway, so a lich rides up on a skeletal horse, gets off, and he has a scroll with these questions on it. But Fang and Talon roll to intimidate this guy, and once again, a nat 20 gets rolled. There were a lot of nat 20s in this game, by the way. It was kind of weird. But at any rate, so the undead villain uh, leaves them alone. And so they decide they'd better head back up to the Earth's surface and ask their dad what's going on, right? And so when they get there to this palace in the sky that we've mentioned in a couple games now, Devlin is there as well. So they start to compare notes, and Dev notices that they were all visited by someone who is undead. So Dev correctly guesses that all of these people with the clipboards and such actually work for the sphere of entropy, whether they themselves realize it or not. So Dev calls Water Bear on his cell phone, and when he does, he can hear construction sounds in the background as Bryce is installing this new vault door onto the moon pool. And so everybody discusses the situation, and then Chet travels to where they are and then casts plane shift to send them all to this new dimension that he's made. Which brings us to the main plot of this game session. When the PCs arrive in this new dimension, they find themselves in this huge room that was inspired by Relativity, which was a lithograph print by M.C. Escher. It is a very famous image that depicts a world in which the normal laws of gravity no longer apply. And famously, there are stairs kind of going every which way, right? That also inspired the ending of the movie Labyrinth, which I feel like there are actually more people I know that are familiar with Labyrinth than they are MC Escher, but you get the gist, right? And while the relativity image itself is more colorless, this world also is kind of like a disco where the floor is made of these colored squares that light up when you walk on them. But due to the fact that there are stairs going every which way, that means that the walls and the ceiling are also made out of these colored tiles that light up anytime somebody walks on them. So there are people dancing here, but they're dancing on the floors and the walls and the ceilings. So, of course, we played some Lionel Richie music for the moment. And this entire dimension was made by Chet. And everybody who's here right now, all of his guests, are all more undead beings like the zombie that Chet met earlier, right? And the idea is they have all their cause of death is that they partied too hard, right? And so these are the guys who Chet is partying with right now. And one of the running gags that we had was that these are supposed to be some of the backup dancers from the Thriller video, right? And other similar 1980s Easter eggs. So the PCs take all of this in, and Chet reveals that he's been abusing his ability to cast any spell he wants. So he's been doing something pretty wild, which is he is using the wish spell to create a brand new substance called fluorescent black. Now, in the world of the game, this stuff affects the brain's signaling system, specifically the chemicals that control things like happiness, focus, how energetic you are, and how motivated you are. Normally, the brain releases a chemical called dopamine when you're excited, focused, or working towards something important. Then the brain pulls it back in so things stay kind of balanced. Fluorescent black changes that, but in a controlled way. It allows dopamine signals to stay active just a little longer, making the user feel extremely happy and alert and confident and focused. But here's the wild part. Because it was created with a wish spell, it was created with built-in safeguards. And if you have been following the channel for a while, you know that my son is very, very smart, and he's very, very good at moments like this. Like I had warned all of my players before the game, everybody was talking about the wish spell. And I said, just so you know, if you tell me that what you wish is to be the richest man on earth, then the way that spell might manifest is that everybody else dies and you still have $5 in your pocket, right? And so they all took it as like a threat, that, hey, this can go horribly wrong. But my son is so good at these moments. He immediately started to write out this thing as if he was a lawyer, very carefully worded of how this can't uh, come back and bite him in the butt, right? So some of the stuff he wrote into how fluorescent black works is that the brain never gets too overwhelmed, the body never goes out of balance, there's no buildup, there's no long-term effects, and there's no risk of harm. You cannot, it's not going to stop your heart or something, right? And visually, fluorescent black looks kind of like a chunk of glowing darkness, right? Like a piece of night sky that somehow kind of shines at the edges. And in short, it seems to be perfectly safe and stable and is a neural enhancer. But as I'm sure you can tell already, this is going to be a problem down the road, right? And again, the irony is that the players are actually scoring points for the opposing team and they just don't know it yet. So, point being, the scene in this party world stretches for hours, and all of these immortal initiates just keep abusing these newfound powers of theirs, right? And the phrase that came to mind for me was power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So the PCs start off with an innocent dance off. My wife and son both again rolled a nat 20, and then of course added their dexterity modifier to see who could dance the best. And also again, they're dancing up the walls and cartwheeling across the ceiling and so on and so forth. But the longer they were here, the weirder and weirder things got until they had the equivalent of a food fight by throwing water balloons full of fluorescent black at each other. Um, at one point, a treasure chest full of this stuff got turned into a mimic by some of the immortals, uh, just because they wanted to, quote unquote, see it get high on its own supply, right? And then they destroyed the coked out mimic. And at one point, a very impaired dev goes to his father's palace in the sky and he's trying to talk to his dad, but his father won't talk to his son while he's like this. And in fact, I kept telling the player, I'm like, he won't even look at you right now. And so Dev is like crying and pouring out his heart to his dad, only to come down from this stuff because it doesn't last very long. And he sobers up and he realizes he's been talking to a marble statue of his father this entire time. And he was so out of his head that he didn't even know what was actually going on. So when he does try to track his dad down, he discovers that his father has left to go deal with a problem in another dimension. So the players asked me what was so important that he couldn't be here. And ironically, I told him the Emperor was off helping some of their other characters with some other problems they had in recent game sessions where they went to him for help, which was kind of a subtle signal to them to solve their own problems rather than wanting NPCs to take care of it for you, right? Which got some laughs out of them, and several of them admitted that that happens more often than it should. Which brings us to what I guess we'll call the epilogue. Um, After days of partying, and the whole party scene took up the entire game day, by the way. I had a lot of other stuff I wanted to do, but they wanted to party instead. So after days of partying, the PCs finally kind of get tired of it and discuss what they should do next. So again, Chet uses his planar abilities to transport them to another realm. This time it resembles a huge cave with a river of lava passing through it. And in the middle of all this is a demogorgon. And not in the Stranger Things sense. I mean, this thing looks kind of like a two-headed baboon with octopus tentacles for arms and stuff like that. So at first they try to use their unlimited spell casting on it, but this thing is highly resistant to spells. So instead they switch over to their various melee weapons, and for the most part they just curb stomp this thing into oblivion, because they are immune to its attacks, but of course it's perfectly vulnerable to what they can dish out. After that, they go back to Party World to celebrate what they just did. And as Dev questions some of the undead there, he gets one of them to mention something called the Council of Necrons, who, as it turns out, are from a different dimension, and they are immortals of the sphere of entropy, which is the sphere that is diametrically opposed to the sphere of matter. People of the sphere of matter are supposed to create, while the sphere of entropy destroys, right? The sphere of matter is supposed to promote life, the sphere of entropy promotes death, right? And at any rate, so that was the cliffhanger that we ended this one on. This one was a really weird one, but it had the players laughing quite a bit. Hopefully, you also were entertained by this one. If so, as always, smash like, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. And from all of us here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.